Go through, and I'm going to cover them all in this lecture. The last two are quite a bit shorter than both epithelium and connective tissue. A lot of epithelial tissue and a lot about connective tissue, less about muscle and nerve. So connective tissue is the most abundant, widely distributed of the four primary tissues. Its functions include binding and support, protecting, insulating, storing, reserve fuel, and transporting substances, as blood turns out to be a class of connective tissue. So there are four classes of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Connective tissue proper can be divided into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, and then regular, irregular, and elastic in the dense. We'll look at those. Then we have cartilage, which is really connecting, in many cases, bone to bone, bone tissue itself, and then blood. So the three characteristics that make connective tissues different from the other primary tissues are: number one, they all have a common embryonic origin, which means they arise from mesenchyme tissue as their tissue of origin. We haven't covered much developmental biology, and I don't know if you have or not, but the mesenchyme is one layer of tissue, one of the three original layers of tissue. And all connective tissues come from that. Connective tissues have a varying degree of vascularity. Remember, epithelium was avascular. Well, some connective tissue is avascular. Other is highly vascularized. The real defining feature, I think, of connective tissue is that the cells are embedded or suspended in what we call an extracellular matrix. It's a protein sugar mesh. That matrix supports the cells, and depending on the type of matrix we have or the different types of connective tissues we have, that can be a weight-bearing matrix, it can be tension bearing matrix, or it can be a liquid matrix in the case of blood. That matrix is going to be made up of ground substance and fibers, and the cells are going to produce the ground substance and fibers and make up the extracellular matrix. Composition and arrangement of those three elements varies considerably within the different types of connective tissue, as we shall see. So ground substance is an unstructured gel-like material filling the space between the cells. It's the medium through which solutes must dissolve. It goes between blood and capillaries and the cells. It's made up of interstitial fluid, CAMs, cell adhesion molecules or cell adhesion proteins that serve as glue for attachment, proteoglycans, which are proteins with sugars attached to them. They're made up of a protein core and one of a large polysaccharides. You may have heard of chondroitin sulfate or hyaluronic acid, available commercially. Those are proteoglycans. Water is trapped in varying amounts in this ground substance, and that will affect the viscosity of the ground substance, how thick it is. So the connective tissue fibers, there are numerous, but we can break it down into three major ones: collagen, elastic, and reticular. Collagen fibers are the strongest, most abundant type. They're very tough. They have a high tensile strength. You can pull both ends and it will last. Then there are elastic fibers, which are long, thin, elastin fibers, and they are elastic because they have the ability to stretch and recoil. Reticular fibers are short, fine, highly branched collagenous fibers. It's a different form of collagen than in collagen fibers. But the reticular fibers are going to give you they're going to have more give to them. They're not as well structurally defined as collagen fibers. Or collagen. Yes. So there's some terms that I've talked about before, but this is where we're really going to see them. Different kinds of cells. A blast cell is an immature cell that will secrete ground substance and extracellular matrix fibers. Fibroblasts are found in connective tissue proper, chondroblasts in cartilage, osteoblasts in bone, and hematopoietic stem cells in bone marrow. Maturing from a blast, you become a cyte, a less active form of the blast that now helps maintain the health of the matrix. So we would have chondrocytes in cartilage and osteocytes in bone. There's a third type of cell that I'll just mention here because we will see it when we look at bone, and that is a cast, C-A-S-T, and osteoclasts are breaking down bone tissue. Other types of cells we might find in connective tissue would include fat cells, which store nutrients, lipid cells, white blood cells, neutrophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes. They're responding to tissue injuries. Mast cells are very important for initiating local inflammatory responses against foreign microorganisms they may detect or during the course of an injury. And similar to that are macrophages, which are phagocytic cells that eat the dead organisms. They are very important in the immune system. They get the immune system started when we get to that. So here's an artist's rendering of what a typical piece of areolar connective tissue may look like. It's a prototype. So if we look at the connective tissue, there are four main types of connective tissue. Again, connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Connective tissue is divided into connective tissue proper, which can be divided into loose and dense connective tissue. There are three types of loose, three types of dense. Cartilage, also into three types of cartilage. We talked about those before. And then bone and blood. So connective tissue proper is all connective tissues except bone, cartilage, and blood. Again, we have proper, loose, and proper dense. The proper loose connective tissues would be areolar, adipose, and reticular. And the connective tissue proper dense would be dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. So areolar connective tissue is the most widely distributed connective tissue. It's going to support and bind tissues. It's a packing material between other tissues. Has fibroblasts that secrete loose arrangements of collagen fibers. Those loose fibers allow for increased amounts of ground substance, and that can act as a water reservoir, holding more interstitial fluid. Again, macrophages and fat cells are contained in those spaces. Here is areolar connective tissue proper. Adipose fat is fat tissue. Excuse me. And fat tissue can be divided into white fat or brown fat. White fat is similar to areolar tissue but has more nutrients being stored there. The cells are called adipocytes. There's a scanty matrix. It's very richly vascularized. It's also involved in shock absorption, insulation, and because of the nutrient storage, energy storage. Brown fat is going to use lipid fuels to heat the bloodstream rather than produce ATP. White fat is used to make ATP in the oxidative phosphorylation process. And fat tissue, adipose tissue, synonymous. Loose, the reticular connective tissue looks a lot like areolar tissue, but the fibers are thinner, reticular fibers as opposed to the collagen fiber. Fibroblasts are called reticular cells. They secrete reticular fibers, that is a thin form of collagen. They're going to form structures like stroma, mesh-like stroma, that support for blood cells. We're going to see a lot of reticular tissues in lymph nodes, spleen, and bone marrow, where our immune system is going to be very active, in some cases developing, in some cases doing what it's supposed to do. That's where we mostly see reticular tissue. And here is a sample from the spleen. The dense connective tissues, dense regular and irregular and elastic. Dense regular has a very high tensile strength. It can withstand tension and stretching. It's closely packed bundles of thick collagen fibers that run parallel to the direction of pull. The fibers appear white Even when you look at them grossly, they have a great resistance for pulling. Fibers are slightly wavy, so there's a little bit of stretch to them. Fibroblasts manufacture those collagen fibers and ground substances. There are very few cells and little ground substance. It is mostly fibers. It is poorly vascularized, and what we're talking about here are really tendons and ligaments, and that's why it's very difficult to naturally heal damage to tendons or ligaments. The resources just aren't there. The irregular connective tissues are the same elements as the dense regular, but the bundles of collagen are thicker and they are more irregularly arranged. They're going to form sheets rather than bundles. And the reason for this is they need to resist tension from several different directions instead of just one main direction. We're going to find these in the dermis, the layer below the skin, fibrous joint capsules, and the fibrous coverings of some organs. Elastic connective tissue. Some ligaments are very elastic, so the ligaments connecting adjacent vertebrae are very elastic. They're also found in the walls of large arteries. That allows those arteries like the aorta to stretch as it fills with blood and then recoil to help push the blood out. So although the heart is the only pump, there is some pressure reserve built up in the aorta. Cartilage, its matrix is secreted by chondroblasts during growth and chondrocytes as adults. Chondrocytes are found in cavities that are called lacunae, which literally means little lake. We're going to see those in bone as well. They're about 80% water packed with collagen fiber and sugared proteins. Chondroitin, hyaluronic acid are two common ones. They're tough but flexible. They do not have nerve fibers. They are avascular. They get their nutrients from the membrane surrounding the cartilage called the perichondrium, and that perichondrium is also the source of chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Cartilage comes in the form of hyaline, elastic, and fibro. Hyaline is the most common, often referred to as gristle, has a shiny bluish glass appearance to it. We find it at the tips of long bones, the end of our nose, in our trachea, larynx, and the cartilage of the ribs. Elastic cartilage is similar, but it has more elastic fibers. We find that in our ears and our epiglottis. And fibrocartilage has properties that are between hyaline cartilage and dense regular connective tissue. It's a really strong form of cartilage. It's found in areas like the intervertebral discs, found in the knee. We will also find it in the joint, the pubic symphysis, between the two pubis bones. Avascular cartilage loses its ability to divide as we age, so injuries heal more slowly. Cartilage injuries are common sports injuries. Later in life, that cartilage can also calcify, become more like bone. That would cause the chondrocytes to die. So now we have bone tissue. Bone tissue is also called osseous tissue. Cells that make it up are called osteocytes and osteoblasts. They support and protect body structures, store fat, synthesize blood in their marrow cavities, has more collagen compared to cartilage, inorganic calcium salts. Osteoblasts produce the matrix. Osteocytes maintain the matrix. Those osteocytes live in little cavities called lacunae that look very much like the ones we saw in cartilage. A structural unit for bone is called an osteon, and we'll look at that more when we talk about the skeletal system. And bone is very richly vascularized. There's a lot of blood in bone. Here is one osteon. Blood is the most atypical connective tissue because it's a fluid. The cells are surrounded by a matrix still, but that matrix is plasma. It's in its liquid form most of the time until it needs to coagulate and stop bleeding. Red blood cells are the most common type of cell found in the blood, although I would argue red blood cells are not really cells, they're cell fragments. They do not have a nucleus. The fibers are soluble proteins that will precipitate, come out of solution during the process of blood clotting. Blood is important for transporting and carrying nutrients, waste, gases, and other substances into and out of the body. Muscle tissue is highly vascularized. It's responsible for most types of movement. Muscle cells possess myofilaments made up of actin and myosin that bring about the contraction. There are 3 different types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle tissue is the tissue we'll look at when we look at the muscular system in a couple of weeks. They attach to and cause movement of bone or skin in some cases. They are also referred to as voluntary muscle because they are under conscious control. Cells are called muscle fibers. They can contain multiple nuclei, and they look striated or banded under the microscope. You can see here. Cardiac muscle is only found in the walls of the heart. It is an involuntary muscle. Like skeletal muscle, it does have striations. The actin and myosin are organized similarly in cardiac and skeletal muscle, but cardiac muscles cells only have 1 nuclei. They are much shorter. Cells are joined together with a structure called an intercalating disc that kind of joins the cytoplasm each to one another. Those intercalated discs are a good way to identify cardiac muscle cells under the microscope. As you can see, we still have the striations, but we also have these intercalated discs. Smooth muscle is found mainly in the walls of the hollow organs, except for the heart. It is also an involuntary muscle. It does not have striations. It still uses actin and myosin for contraction, but they're organized differently in the cell. Smooth muscle cells are kind of a spindle shape, narrow on both ends, wider in the middle, with 1 nucleus. And here you have a skeletal muscle tissue. If you recall, last week in the lab, you looked at teased smooth muscle cells. So those were smooth muscle cells that had been separated from one another. Nervous tissue is the main component of the nervous system. The brain, spinal cord, and nerves regulates and controls body functions. It's made up of 2 specialized types of cells. The first, the one that gets most of the press, the neurons, are the specialized cells that generate and conduct nerve impulses. While there are supporting cells that are going to support, insulate, and protect neurons, those supporting cells are known as neuroglia. All right, we're going to stop there. That covers all our tissues. Next, we'll talk about some membranes and the healing process in the 3rd and final lecture.